that you were able to join us today. Many in this room today and online are our partners and donors and stakeholders, and we want to thank you for being here today for this important discussion. Thanks for your continued support of Feed Ontario, and we hope that today's discussion will engage you into deeper work that we do. As I'm sure you've heard, food bank use across Ontario has never been higher, with food banks experiencing the 6th consecutive year of increased demand. And what makes this even more startling is that we've seen a 64% increase in first-time users since pre-pandemic. Feed Ontario supports a collective of over 1,200 affiliated hunger relief agencies, from food banks to community kitchens to shelters to meal programs, snack programs, seniors programs, anything that provides emergency food support to someone in need. And last year alone, we provided support to over 600,000 people who visited over 4.3 million times. And unfortunately, as we've said, that numbers continues to grow every single day. Our network consists of members of various sizes, scopes, and operating models, each with their own set of unique circumstances and challenges. And with rising inflation and the increased cost of housing and inadequate support programs, more people are turning to food banks for help. As our research shows, currently 1 in 5 food bank visitors have to skip meals in order to afford to pay for their rent, and over 60% have less than $100 left at the end of the month for necessities, including transportation, utilities, medicine, and food. That simply isn't enough, and it's simply not okay. Today's discussion is an important one. Our 3 expert panelists here today will highlight contributing factors as to why so many people in Ontario are struggling to get ahead, and why it's harder to escape poverty today than it was 30 years ago. Our conversation will also speak to the challenges that food banks are facing in terms of increased demand, and will highlight the need for improvement to Ontario's social assistance programs and the need to make housing more affordable. The one thing I will say is we were supposed to have 4 panelists. So unfortunately, Glenn Pearson could not be here today due to a family emergency, but we are still so fortunate to have our other 3 panelists in attendance. Before we do get started, I do want to share that today's event would not have been possible if it weren't for our incredible partner Visa in tackling food insecurity and our presenting sponsor. Thank you for hosting this important discussion and for your continued support and for your commitment to supporting those in our communities who are facing hunger. With that, I would now like to turn it over to Tasha to say a few words.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Tasha Ismail, and I lead social impact here at Visa Canada. And I'm happy to welcome you all to our office this morning. So when you think about Visa, what comes to mind? Credit card payments. That's right. But did you also know that we're a purpose-driven company? And what does that mean? That means we are driven to be able to uplift everyone everywhere. So that's part of the fiber of how we operate. And so being purpose-driven also means that we're not only focused on our financial performance, but also making a positive impact. We put our purpose in every day through our products, our partnerships, and our people. We innovate to provide secure, convenient, and affordable payment solutions for millions of consumers and businesses. And we collaborate with governments and not-for-profits and other stakeholders to address the challenges of financial inclusion, digital identity, and environmental sustainability. And we empower our employees to volunteer, donate, and support the causes that they care about. We have a bunch of Visa employees here this morning who are very enthusiastic about this cause. So earlier this year, the Visa Foundation said to us, we want to invest in our communities where we live and work, but we want that investment to be driven by our employees. And so the Visa Canada team came together and through a consultation process identified food insecurity and hunger as the top issue facing our communities where we live, where we work. And it was an easy choice to select Feed Ontario to be a $250,000 grant winner through the Visa Foundation, because you're doing amazing work, not only to address food insecurity, but also poverty. Which brings us to this morning's event. And so we really welcome you here and hope you feel at home and enjoy some light breakfast and coffee. So thank you.
So with that, we will get started. Sorry. With that, we're going to get started. And so now I'm going to introduce our speakers for today's event. So in the middle, we have Talia Bronstein, the VP of Research and Advocacy at Daily Bread Food Bank. Talia is an advocate for income security and affordable housing to alleviate poverty and food insecurity. Having worked in the public, private, and not-for-profit sector, she brings a unique perspective to building collaborative relationships with community members, partner organizations, and government to tackle complex systems-level policy issues. Talia holds a Master of Public Health from the University of Toronto and was honored to receive the Francis Lankin Inspiring Leadership Award in 2021. Goodness. I didn't anticipate a microphone, so apologies. Trevor, to my right, is a proud Nova Scotian, a musician who traveled all over Canada and an ODSP advocate as co-chair of the ODSP Action Coalition. He spent 20 years working in market research and senior project and resource management roles before a debilitating neuromuscular condition ended his career. He is an active participant in various grassroots advocacy groups, and I've been told has a small but impressive collection of Hot Wheels. And our final panelist on the left is Douglas Kwan, the Director of Advocacy and Legal Services at the Advocacy Centre for Tenants of Ontario. ACTO is a community legal clinic with a provincial focus to provide legal services to low-income Ontarians to ensure that they have safe, adequate, and affordable housing. Prior to joining ACTO, Douglas worked for the Mississauga Community Legal Services for 16 years, working his way to co-executive director. He has the extensive experience in practicing housing law before the Landlord and Tenant Board and has promoted safe and affordable housing policies with decision makers and community agencies. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And with that, let's jump right into our discussion. So Talia, let's start with you. You started working with food banks just before the pandemic. I'm sure in the last 5 years, things have changed incredibly. What changes have you observed in terms of demographics of people visiting food banks and the way food banks have adapted? What do you think is really driving this change?
Thanks, Caroline, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here bright and early, although it's not so bright, dark and early. So yeah, I joined Daily Bread Food Bank in 2019. And at that time, as I say to anybody who asks, who are we serving at food banks? We serve a cross section of society. Every kind of demographic you see in a city are coming to a food banks, but to greater and lesser degrees. Back in 2019, the biggest proportion of people we were seeing were those relying on social assistance. And why? Because social assistance rates are abysmally low. A single individual today on Ontario Works receives only $733 per month, and a single individual on Ontario Disability Support Program receives $1,308 per month. So that's not even close to the poverty line. That's for ODSP $1,000 below the poverty line, and for OW that's about a third of the poverty line. So that was kind of the biggest group we were seeing in 2019. And then the pandemic came. And, as every organization, as every community member, we were grappling with how do we adapt? And almost instantly, we knew we were an essential service. We have always been an essential service and we couldn't close down. It wasn't an option for us. So we had to figure out a way to adapt our services. And what we ended up seeing was more and more people who were employed coming to food banks because, during the pandemic, a lot of workplaces temporarily shut down, and then we're still seeing the after effects of that. Then you get inflation hitting hard, and all of a sudden, again, more and more people are struggling to make ends meet. The cost of food has become a growing proportion of someone's budget, and so on top of that, rent is continuing to go up as well. And so just that deficit between people's income and expenses continues to grow. And so, someone asked us, what's kind of the ceiling? What's the cap? What's the maximum number of people you could possibly serve at food banks? And the reality is, before the pandemic, we were serving about 65,000 client visits per month. Today, we're serving 270,000 visits, so about quadruple. And if you had asked us in 2019, would your organization be able to provide food for 270,000 client visits per month? We would have literally laughed and said, absolutely not. But the reality is we expand to meet that need. Food banks across Ontario have done the same. People have stepped up, community has stepped up to support our work, to be able to make ends meet for food banks, to be able to get that food out the door. But what happens next, right? That's the thing that we're most concerned about, is where do we go from here?
Thanks so much, Talia. And semi-related, Doug, I'll turn it over to you. In your opinion, what are the biggest factors from the last 30 years that have shaped how we really got into this affordable housing crisis that really seems to be contributing to why that's driving this increase in demand at food banks?
I think to answer that question, we have to look back 50 years ago, where in the 40s and 50s, we were welcoming back our veterans. We were a growing country. We were trying to attract new immigrants to help build our growing nation. And every level of government was in the business of creating housing. And we were very successful, creating co-ops, nonprofits, purpose-built rentals. Up until the early 90s, we were building housing. And then in the early 90s, we stopped. The federal government stopped creating housing and relied on the private sector to do the work. And what we've seen since then is that the private sector has created very little housing that's affordable. About 9% over the last 25 years of new builds have been purpose-built rentals, and no co-ops or very few co-ops or nonprofits were created since then. And so we've seen the fact that luxury rentals in the last 5 years have been the primary units that have been created. Approximately 87% of all units are luxury rentals, and we've defined luxury rentals as rentals that are going for $3,000 or more. So in that climate, people are struggling.
And so almost an extension to that, what are some of the implications if this, in the future, if this trend continues?
Well, we're seeing that already. We're seeing ads where people are renting a portion of their mattress for $900. We're seeing situations where I lived in Toronto all my life, and I've never seen visible homelessness to such a degree. The current market rent for a 2-bedroom in Toronto is $3,300, and you just spoke about people on fixed income. There is no way that that anyone on social assistance or minimum wage or even what we consider middle class can afford to rent in Toronto anymore. People are struggling. And used to be renting was a gateway to save money towards home ownership, and it's no longer that situation. And what's going to happen in the future is that we're not seeing any mobility. We're hearing stories where people can't move out of their home after they graduate university or when they're starting a family. That's usually a time when they're looking to live independently and they can't afford to do that. People who are separating or divorcing are forced to live together longer because they simply can't afford to find a place to live. And so we're seeing that happening now. And then looking down the road, every level of government seems to be focused on building new housing. And that's all well and good, but that takes time. That takes 10 years. That takes a generation before that new housing becomes affordable and overcomes the demand in the market. Meanwhile, we have rent control schemes where new units aren't rent controlled. So you may have heard of this, any unit built after November 15, 2018 is exempt from rent control forever. So you could have tenants who are living there who want to stay there for 4 or 5 years, but they would be experiencing double-digit increases. And we're already seeing that across the province.
Obviously, for people on fixed income, that's virtually impossible, as we've talked about, in creating a complete crisis. For Trevor, in your experience as someone who is a recipient of the ODSP program, how have you seen this program evolve over the years? And how has it changed and impacted recipients in the way that Talia and Douglas are referring to?
Well, I've been an ODSP recipient since 2016. So, and before I applied for ODSP, I knew nothing about ODSP. I spent 10 weeks in hospital, and then when I started learning about the rules for ODSP just before I was being discharged, it just blew my mind. All of these ridiculous rules. I spent 20 years in a career. I had, a job, and I made pretty decent money at the time. And like a responsible person would do, you invest in RSPs, I had GICs, just some modest investment. So when I applied for ODSP, it was in 2015. It really took me by surprise about how horrible they treat people and don't recognize at what they were doing and what they're still doing is legislated poverty, keeping people in poverty. At that time, when I applied, the asset limit for ODSP, you're only allowed to have $5,000 in assets in order to qualify for the program. And so when the intake worker, when you apply for ODSP, they basically shine a flashlight up your ass. Like they want to know everything about you, who you live with, all your bank records for the past 2 years and everything. And before that, I had supported myself with no means of income for 3 years in Toronto. So I burned through a lot of cash. And at the time, I thought it was down to my last dime, but the intake worker is circling, oh, you have too much money. And I was furious. What do you mean I have too much money? Who came up with this $5,000 limit? Like, does that mean, does all of a sudden I'm rich because I have $5,000 in the bank? Couldn't remember the last time I had less than $5,000 in the bank. So when they were telling me that, so that was one change, that the previous provincial government was able to get through. There was a number of changes on the books that they were going to put through before the 2018 election. And, then everything changed. But at least they were able to increase the asset limit to $40,000. So that is one step in the right direction. It was too late for me, but at least people applying now are not going to have to be destitute before they qualify for a program that's not going to provide them enough money on which to live. Some other changes that have taken place since then, the rates were frozen from 2018 until last year. And last year, before on the campaign trail, all of the party leaders were saying they were going to double ODSP, and the Liberals were saying they were going to increase by 20%. Conservatives said, okay, we're going to increase it by 5%. Of course, Conservatives won, so we had a 5% increase. But, to their credit, they also tied rates to inflation going forward. So there was a 6.5% increase this past June that helps. And so that was a 12.5% increase. And it's remarkable, I find, that it took a conservative government to increase rates more than they ever been increased in the entire history of the program. Some other more recent changes have taken place with regards to earnings from employment before they just changed it no, when did that come into effect? It was within the last year anyway, that they increased the earnings from employment was $200 a month with a 50% clawback on anything over $200 a month, but they increased that to $1,000 a month. So that is a step in the right direction. The problem is the $1,000 earnings exemption only applies to the person in the benefit unit that has a disability. And by benefit unit, that means like your family, whoever the person with a disability lives with. Because whoever is in the benefit unit, their income counts as your income. So anything that your spouse or partner may bring into the household, that gets taken away by ODSP. they didn't change the rule to include people, spouses or adult dependents. They left them at the old $200 and 50% thereafter, but the person with a disability is allowed to earn $1,000 a month with a 75% clawback thereafter. So, nobody's going to want to work more than $1,000 a month and then work for 75% less, after they reach $1,000 a month. So that was a change. It was a step in the right direction, but it's not broad enough. Anyway, those are some of the changes. It hasn't evolved a whole lot.
And what do you think might be some of the consequences for people with these types of changes? The limited changes, the impact as it relates to fixed income and housing. For people living on ODSP, what do we think some of the long-term consequences are going to be of insufficient social programs?
We're seeing it now. Like I said, I moved to Toronto in 1990, and I have never seen it like this since I've lived here. Tent cities popping up everywhere. I never used to see that. All roads lead to housing, and housing is the fundamental basis on which somebody can set themselves up for success. If you are constantly worried about paying bills and you're paying rent, and you take on sort of a hunter-gatherer mindset almost. You're not worried about next week. You're just worried about how you're going to get through today. And the costs, it costs more to keep people in poverty than it does to lift people out of poverty. So if we continue down this path, you're going to see more homelessness. You're going to see more ER visits. You're going to see more involvement with the judiciary, and leaving housing up to the profit-driven private market, which, as Douglas pointed out, has been going, sort of really started on that descent back in the 80s and 90s when government got out of the business of housing and said, oh, we're just going to leave it to the private market. The market will dictate and everything will be fine. But, as Douglas was mentioning, the luxury apartments, there's no housing that people on assistance can afford. And those that are living in rent controlled buildings, such as myself, I've been living in the same apartment for 11 years. If I was to move out today, that same apartment would be going for 40% more than what I'm paying now. For actually more like 50% more, 50 to 60% more. So I'm in a position where I can't afford to stay where I am, but I can't afford to move either.
Yeah.
So there's a perception out there that people on assistance, all of the rent is subsidized, when we know that is far from the truth, that only around 10% of ODSP recipients live in rent geared to income or subsidized housing. 70% are in private market dwellings, and 5% are owners, another 5% or another 10% are boarders, and another 5% are other, or homeless, perhaps. Anyway, I think I'll stop there.
No, thank you. And I think the reality is that facing so many of Ontarians should be concerning to everyone, as I'm sure everyone in the room hearing you guys speak today. Talia, can you comment on some of the work that's being done across the province by food banks such as Daily Bread, both in terms of service to people in need, but also in their advocacy work to help address some of these key issues?
Absolutely. So Daily Bread Food Bank, our mission is twofold. One is to distribute food out to the community to support those who need to access that food, and also to pursue the elimination of poverty and food insecurity through advocacy. So on the food side of the equation, we have a network of 200 food programs operating across the city, and that might be food banks, meal programs, as Carolyn mentioned. There's lots of different types of food programs. And we've seen this huge increase, as I've mentioned. And, you know, inflation is impacting how many people need to come to the food bank, but it's also impacting us at the food bank, right? Because we don't get enough food donations to cover off the amount of food that we distribute. So we purchase the deficit. And, we also want to make sure people have a variety of balanced food offerings. So we are also sort of getting hit with that inflation as well. So our dollar doesn't go as further. But thanks to the support of the community, we've been able to keep up with that demand. But we've gone from spending about $1.5 million per year on food to spending $22 million on food per year just to meet the demand. And that's not even to give people, all the food that they could need to make it through the week. That's to give them 3 days worth of food. And we know that from our annual survey of food bank clients, even with that food, some of our clients are still going an entire day without eating, or they are missing a meal to pay for a bill. They still don't have enough food to make it through the month, even with that support from a food bank oftentimes. So it's a huge demand. And so handing out that food or distributing out that food through the city, it's so important to meet people's immediate need, but it's not going to address the root causes. And the root cause of the food insecurity we're seeing in Toronto is really about a deficit in income. It's about people's income not being able to keep up with their incredibly high cost of housing, the high cost of food, and all those other expenses people need, transportation. So for our clients, they have about $8 left per person per day to afford after paying their rent, to afford everything else, all of their food, their transportation, their toiletries and whatnot. And when we think 2 trips on the TTC, that's more than $6. There goes your whole day's worth of budget. So people have to make really difficult decisions. And so that's why advocacy is so incredibly important to what we do. And we do an annual survey of food bank clients to understand what are the contributing factors? Why are people turning to food banks? What are their experiences? And we use that to make evidence-based recommendations to government. And the 3 areas that we think are the solutions to food insecurity are income supports, adequate income supports, affordable housing, and decent work. And you really need all 3 of those things to be working in tandem. Because if you imagine a world where maybe people have an adequate income, but the housing continues on the trajectory we're on, we're still going to have an affordability crisis because that housing piece of the equation needs to be addressed. And if people are working, but they are in precarious jobs, maybe they have an adequate income, but they don't have any sick days. Maybe they can, they have no employer provided health benefits or dental benefits. They're still going to be in a really precarious situation if they need dental work done. That's really costly. So you need all 3 of those pieces to be working in tandem. And the one piece we're really optimistic about right now that we're focusing a lot of our energy on is the Canada Disability Benefit, which is a new benefit the federal government has proposed that would be a top-up, and it would help individuals who are living with a disability, who have a low income, sort of increase their income amount. And the goal behind it is to reduce poverty and to improve financial security amongst people, working age people with disabilities. And so we are advocating so hard for this benefit because close to half of our clients have a disability. And as Trevor mentioned, they're legislated to live in poverty. And that's just really unacceptable. So that's an area that we're really optimistic about. So there is a good news story, hopefully, in our future, if we can push hard enough and if we can rally the community enough to make that happen.
Thanks, Talia. I think this is going to be a question for everyone, but Douglas, maybe we'll start with you. So similar to what Talia said, food banks have been this source of support for almost 40 years. And as any food banker will say, we'd love to be out of business. From a housing lens, similar to the advocacy work that Talia was just mentioning, what do we think can be done, both in short term and long term, to help put us out of business through a housing lens?
You know, I don't think what I'm about to say is anything new. A lot of people have said the same thing over many years. Yes, we have to build supply so that we have enough housing stock for people in, you know, the next generation, the generations afterwards. But we can also work on immediate goals, such as ensuring that our existing housing supply is still affordable. And we're losing our affordable housing stock by, you know, we're seeing more short-term rental operators, for example, pulling their units and not making those units available for long-term tenants. We're seeing situations where the rent control exemptions are having an impact in accelerating the rental crisis and also acts as an incentive for, you might have heard this term, dem evictions, rent evictions, or bad faith evictions that are happening across the province. I'm letting people who are living in tents in, say, Trinity Bellwoods, they used to live in Trinity Bellwoods, but they were served with a notice by their landlord saying, I want to move in for my family when there's like 4 units in that building. Simply because that person was paying below market rent. So solutions include building more supply, focused supply on what's not being provided by the private market, which is transitional housing, supportive housing, social housing. There still is a stigma in building that type of housing by private developers, and that's, you know, has always been there ever since I've been working in the sector. But so it's really a role for government to come in to provide the housing that's not being provided by the private sector. And on the demand side, more stricter rules on reducing the number of short-term units. And we're seeing that at the municipal level. We're seeing that, for example, in British Columbia, they're restricting short-term rentals for units where the owner occupies the units, and that's the only way you can rent out your unit for that purpose. So those are some of the ways, also including closing some of the rent control exemptions. We understand from other levels of government that the idea is to spur the creation of purpose-built rentals. But as I said before, the stats really haven't supported that. Only 9% have been purpose-built rentals, and the rest have been for home ownership purposes like townhouses, condos, and detached homes. So we really need to close those rent control loopholes, because really by signing a legislation tomorrow, we can make life more affordable for all Ontarians without even putting a shovel in the ground.
And Trevor, maybe from your lens as well, similar kind of question. How can we make change, broadly speaking, for those who are living in poverty, for those who have lived experience on government programs? What sorts of improvements can we make to the programs to help make them, one, more accessible, but also more supportive for those who are accessing them?
Good question. You know, the obvious answer is giving people enough money to survive in today's climate. Like the housing costs, like Douglas is saying, and the food bank visits are breaking records every month, it seems. So it comes down to, like, it's as simple as that. People need money to survive. And, you know, we're seeing all of the symptoms of people trying to survive on you know, below poverty income levels. There is, you know, there's a way to allow people to lift themselves out of poverty and maybe stop clawing back income, let more people in the benefit unit earn a living, like bring money into the household without having it clawed back. And affordable housing is the big elephant in the room, if you will. It's without, you know, there's a finite number or amount of rent geared to income or subsidized housing out there. So instead of putting 60,000 people on a wait list for 10 years why not supply portable housing benefits, particularly for people that are housed so they stay housed? And then, you know, like 30 to 40% of our shelters are made up of Ontario Works and the ODSP recipients, you know, and immigrants. There's you know, it like I said, it just boils down to being able to afford things so you don't wind up in destitution.
Thanks, Trevor. And so Talia, maybe we'll wrap up just with a question, semi-related in relation to all these things. What could people in this room do to get involved, to help make some of this change that we're looking forward to and talking about today?
Yeah, I love that question. There's so much people can do to kind of move the needle forward. I mean, attending an event like this is part of what you can be doing in terms of raising your own awareness, sharing those learnings with your friends and your family, talking about, you know, what are you seeing in your community? What could be changed? And I think a lot of people feel really disenfranchised, that maybe they don't have a voice, or these issues are so complex that how am I as an individual supposed to contribute to change? But the reality is, the more people who are talking about these issues, who are advocating for change, that's how the momentum builds. And so I would really encourage everyone here to, right after this this discussion, to get on your phone, Google who your, you know, city councillor, MPP, MP is, and send them an email and just say, I just went to a talk and I heard all of these stats about food bank use and rising housing affordability, and the challenges that social assistance recipients and ODSP recipients are facing. And I want to see action. You know, as simple as that, making sure it's on their radar. That's our role as community members, is to make sure government knows what are the priority areas we want them to be focusing on. You don't have to be an expert in the solutions. You don't have to solve all these problems yourself. The number one thing you can do is make sure those issues are on the agenda, and that you are, you know, getting involved, you know, come election time, that you're paying attention. What are candidates promising? Who do you want to vote for? Who's going to actually advance some of these issues? So I think there's an incredibly powerful role we can all play in terms of moving some of these issues forward.
Thanks so much. And Feed Ontario does have a Hunger in My Riding tool on our website, so you can easily find who your MPP is, your stats, and all that very easily available for you. So we now just wanted to open it up to the audience to see if they had any questions for our panelists. Sure.
Thank you so much to the panelists. All such interesting and diverse areas of expertise, but it all comes down to food insecurity in the end. And my question is for Douglas. You had mentioned, you know, we know that there was a huge divestment from the federal government in terms of housing and building, in particular, purpose-built and social housing in the 50s and 60s. That fell off, and now we're in this situation. I also know that there have been comments from some politicians in the federal government around the role of the federal government not being focused on housing, and that really it's a municipal and a provincial issue. What role would you want to see the federal government play to address the situation that we're in now?
I think they've made some strides in the form of the national housing strategy, where they've enshrined the right to housing in legislation, but they've also backed that with dollars. What's lacking is that there's a focus on new builds at not very affordable rates. It's 80% of the average market rent, which I said earlier, average market rent is really unattainable for many people. What I'd like to see them do is use their powers, and you can see this in other realms such as childcare, where they're talking to provincial governments and saying, we're putting dollars on the table. We want you to find improvements. I mean, at the municipal level, there's a municipal accelerator fund that's $4 billion, where they're trying to convince municipalities to adopt 4 units as of right for buildings that are for single family use only, and that encourages more density in communities and creates more housing. I'd like them to see a more stronger focus, a concentrated focus on social housing, rent geared income housing, helping support the nonprofits and co-op sector, because they're very successful back in the 60s and 70s when they were created to provide affordable housing. And so those are some of the tools that they could utilize. Of course, there's also income tax tools that the federal government has, which then can possibly disincentivize the financialization of housing, where we have units for people who want to live in those units, as opposed to units that are merely financial instruments. So those are some of the ways.
Talia, you talked a little bit about how this is a question actually for all panelists, but you had talked about how individuals, what they could do, what we could be doing to make a difference. And I'm curious if you all have thoughts about how the business community can be making a difference.
Yeah, great question. I think in a couple of different ways. First of all, I think in the same way that individuals can have a voice, businesses can also have a voice in terms of advocacy. The reality is that government cares a lot about the voices of the business sector. And so if we had a company like Visa, not to put you on the spot, going to a member of parliament, the minister, and saying, we really support the Canada Disability Benefit because we think it is going to reduce poverty and food insecurity amongst people with disabilities, and that's the right thing to do. That would have huge power, and that would actually help us address the issues we're seeing on the ground. That would, help us reduce the line at food banks. So that's a really powerful role. And then the other piece is in terms of, as an employer, for an example, making sure that employees have decent work. So making sure people have, working towards a living wage, making sure people have access to health benefits, dental benefits, retirement benefits, sick days. These are actions that businesses can take to make sure that their employees are set up for success in terms of being able to afford their basic necessities. So I think there's a lot that can be done. And then, of course, working in partnership with local community organizations. We're fortunate at food banks. We have a lot of amazing partners like Visa that are our donors and supporters. And so that's another way to kind of continue to support the work. I don't know if it
You covered it all.
Thank you. Douglas, you talked a bit about this, but I'm wondering for Trevor and Talia, do you think the federal national housing strategy goes far enough, and how would you improve it?
It's not working. Whatever the housing strategy is, it's not working. It's not working fast enough. And we have so much work to do just to catch up to all of the loss that has happened over the past few decades that we need to build housing, obviously, and we need to make sure the housing is affordable and accessible.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's an important step forward. There's a lot of good elements to that strategy, in particular the recognition that housing is a human right, I think is a really important step forward. That's something we're hoping that can also, be moved forward in terms of the right to food in Canada. So the challenge is the implementation of it, right? And as Trevor said, it's such a massive challenge that we're always playing catch up. So is there room to improve? Yes, but I do think it was a turning point, I would say, in recent years that it brought a lot of attention to housing in Canada. And I think it sort of set a new course where right now, if you hear any level of government, they're all talking about housing, housing, housing. It is like the number one issue on people's agendas. And I think the federal housing strategy was helped kind of with that turning point. So I do give it credit. And I think we have to celebrate successes where we can, because it feels, as someone who does advocacy for a living, it can feel few and far between. So, I do want to recognize that was a really important strategy, but does it go far enough? No.
My question is also for Talia. Talia, why do you think we're seeing so many people with jobs using food banks?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's two things at play. One is that not all jobs are created equally, as I've talked about. So we have seen a rise in precarious work over the past decade or so. So we're seeing more and more people just generally in society who, we've seen the rise of the gig economy, where people don't have labor protections in the same way. We have seen in 2018 a lot of labor protections were rolled back in terms of equal pay for temporary and part-time workers, the elimination of a paid sick day clause in legislation. So I think we've seen kind of an erosion of employment in recent years, and that affects low-income workers in particular. And that's who we're seeing come to food banks by and large. Now, we do see occasionally people who have what was on paper a good income, a decade ago. You would think, Trevor, to borrow your story, Trevor was telling us before this about an aunt who was a general manager at a retail store and was able to afford a house and a car, a couple decades ago. And that's just not the case anymore. The cost of living has escalated so much beyond how much wages have increased. There's that piece. And then there's, I think the affordability, it's affecting us all. Food inflation is really top of mind right now. It maybe is settling a tiny bit, but when we've surveyed clients, the affordability challenges they're facing are really top of mind. So for our clients, about the vast majority are renting in the private market. And which sort of makes sense because people who are in subsidized housing, presumably, if they're paying 30% of their income on housing, they actually have, the remainder to afford the food that they need. That's considered affordable housing. For the clients we're serving, they're renting in the private market. 90% of them are in unaffordable housing. 20% of them are paying 100% of their income on their housing. There's nothing left at the end of the month for food. And so there's that relationship with affordable housing that I think is so critically important in Toronto, that even if you have a decent job, if you are paying, $2,500 a month, $3,000 a month for rent, it's not going to get you very far.
Thank you. This question is for Douglas. I understand that we see a lack of access to legal aid and that there are tremendously long wait times to get your case heard at the landlord-tenant board. And I was wondering if you could speak to the impact of that and what more we should be advocating for on that front.
Thank you for the question. In 2019, legal aid's budget was cut by 33% by the provincial government, which has had an impact on access to services. Legal aid is, and legal clinics in particular, pride themselves in upstream support so that people are supported before they end up in crisis. The landlord-tenant board is the place where disputes are settled between landlords and tenants. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is the digitization of services and a real digital barrier being created by that process. And just give you an example. So in the past, people would know where the landlord-tenant board is by the signs. They would know, for example, when I came to here for this conversation, I knew where to go without having to ask any questions because I saw the visa sign, I saw so many welcoming faces, I knew how to get here. However, when you give someone a series of numbers and letters, it's far more difficult, especially when they're not used to the process. As well as trying to resolve disputes, there used to be lots of hallway conversations that would help that, which happens in an in-person environment, not so on Zoom where only one person can speak. And so that's caused significant delays at the landlord-tenant board, the digital barriers, because people have dropped calls, they are unable to participate. And legal aid and legal clinics who would be physically there to support tenants, connect with rent banks, for example. Let's just say they had a bad couple of months, but they're back on their feet and they need support. Legal clinics could connect them to the rent bank and then preserve their tenancy. And so that connection with people, it no longer exists. So As a result, delays are 7 to 9 months for landlord applications and up to 2 years for tenant applications. And so because so many people are losing faith at the landlord-tenant board, we're seeing a rise in landlords pulling their units out of the market and making them short-term rentals instead. We're seeing rent strikes because tenants aren't having their concerns addressed at the landlord-tenant board. So it had a profound impact on the overall housing crisis.
Talia, this one's for you. We all know of the rising use of food banks for children. Is there anything that you can talk about or anything we can do to help in that area?
Yeah, good question. So at Daily Bread Food Bank, about a quarter of the clients we're serving are children and youth. And interestingly, child poverty in Canada has been on the decline pretty steadily for the past, I'm not sure how many years exactly, but because we have the Canada Child Benefit. And the Canada Child Benefit there's been research that's shown it has directly impacted and reduced the amount of severe food insecurity in Canada. So we know that when we give people income, they are better able to afford food and feed their families. So that's been a really positive thing. And what we actually saw during the pandemic was child poverty declined even further because in addition to the regular benefits, there were a top up to the Canada Disability Benefit. There was the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB, to support people. So we actually saw child poverty dip even further. But then since those benefits ended, now we're seeing an uptick in child poverty again. And I think, again, that relates to the affordability challenges that we're seeing. The more mouths you have to feed in the family, the harder it's going to be on that when you're paying more at the grocery store. You need a bigger unit to live in if you have multiple people in the household. And so the affordability piece of housing goes up. If a family is evicted from their unit, or they need to move for whatever reason, getting a new vacant unit that's a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom apartment, depending on the family size, that can set you back thousands of dollars per month and just might be out of reach for people. So it is something that we're seeing more and more at the food bank. It is a growing population that we're seeing, unfortunately. And I think there's a few things that can be done about it. One is better targeting the Canada Child Benefit. It actually provides a pretty decently sized benefit for people with kind of middle to higher incomes. And that's kind of a very political, no one's going to say no to money for children. But what we could be doing is increasing the benefit amount for the lowest income families to better target that benefit. And then there's also been a lot of talk about school food programs. So Canada is one of the few countries in the kind of G7 countries that doesn't have a national school food program. So it's very patchwork. In Toronto, we do have school food programs operating. They're funded by the province, the city, and kind of charitable donations, about a third. And the funding has not been keeping pace with the growing demand. The same growing demand we're seeing at food banks, they're seeing at school nutrition programs, and not every school has them. They put these programs into schools based on sort of the demographics of the community, which is a reasonable and smart approach. But we know that food insecurity is growing. And so it's seeping into communities that even have more middle to higher income on average. More people are food insecure than are those living in poverty, because you can be above the poverty line and still be experiencing food insecurity. So I think we definitely need to see more investments also in those school nutrition programs.
Question for Douglas. You mentioned how the government went away from building homes quite some time ago, and how the private sector has been building homes for different reasons, basically for profit. There's, I believe, are you familiar with the the Housing TO action plan that the city is putting to a vote, I think, in the next couple of weeks? So they're proposing some 65,000 housing units that are going to include co-op, geared income, and what have you. I just wanted to get your thoughts about that, first of all. And second of all, is there an opportunity for private-public partnership in building homes in Toronto and in Canada in general?
Thank you for the question. I think that approach is incumbent upon senior levels of government also contributing finances for the city of Toronto to make that action plan a reality. It's a plan that I think many people who work in the sector feel that is necessary because there is a gap. However, there is also opportunities for partnerships as well. It's not a binary decision, a binary choice. Governments can work with the private sector absolutely to make. I've seen many successes building seniors affordable housing with the private sector as well. It's just we just don't have enough of what we need, and we've seen the impact of rising mortgage rates on the new construction of buildings, and that's caused a tremendous slowdown in the creation of new units. And so governments, they're not as strongly impacted by that, and so we still need to continue with the work of creating housing that's affordable, and that's what's needed. But certainly, private and public partnerships are part of the solution for sure.
Thanks. My question's for Trevor, and you painted a very clear picture of what people are currently experiencing in Toronto, with the amount of people that are receiving social assistance, that are living in shelters and moving into parks. There's still a very common perception, I guess, from people who maybe are not so familiar with social assistance programs that ODSP and OW recipients are just sitting at home and taking tax dollars. And I'm wondering if you can just comment on how that is not true and how you position your response to that sort of commentary.
Thanks for that question. It sounds like you're referring to something that our premier said a few months ago at an event at the Empire Club, where he was up on the stage and he was talking about people on Ontario Works, and said, it drives them crazy that you have 400,000 healthy people sitting at home collecting your hard-earned dollars. Talking about people on Ontario Works that receive $733 a month. Number one, nobody surviving on $733 a month is healthy, no matter what way you cut it. And sitting at home, if they have a home, $733 a month, you might be able to find a rundown room in an illegal rooming house somewhere out in the outskirts of Scarborough for maybe $600 a month. But to say that people are sitting at home collecting your hard-earned dollars when you're only receiving that much money, you are getting up, you have to leave the house, because how are you going to eat? You're busy thinking about, going to the food bank, going to what meal programs are available that day. Well, you don't have money for transit, so you got to walk, or you got to figure out, maybe you have a bicycle if you're lucky and you get around on that. But to say that there's healthy people sitting at home collecting your hard-earned tax dollars I thought it was very disingenuous for the premier to say something like that. There's 30% of those people are children. There's another, percentage, 30,000 people that are single mothers that have children that they can't afford childcare, they can't afford daycare for them, or their children have disabilities and require a lot of attention and a lot of support, very high needs children, or I forget what I was going to say there. But yeah, there's just it's a fallacy to say that there's healthy people sitting at home or taking your tax dollars when people are struggling just to get by every day. It's not like nobody aspires to be on Ontario Works. Nobody aspires to be on ODSP. It is not something that anybody would want to put themselves through. It's very degrading. It's invasive. It is undignifying. It is the worst. It's not something that anybody is going to voluntarily go through unless they have to go through, unless they have no other choice. Another thing about people on Ontario Works, we know there's a very high percentage of people on Ontario Works that have disabilities that for one reason or another can't access ODSP because they don't have a family physician. Over 2 million people in Ontario don't have a doctor. And you have all these forms that you're supposed to get filled out, by your doctor. And if you don't have a relationship, you can't go into a walk-in clinic and say, hey, can you fill out this stuff for me and tell them, why I'm my doctor, why I can't go to work, it's yeah, it's just not something that anybody wants to put themselves through, and nobody's going to voluntarily do it. Thanks, your turn.
So I'm conscious of time. So that's gonna wrap up today's panel. But I do want to thank Douglas and Talia and Trevor for being here today and sharing your incredible insights and expertise on these issues. I think everyone in the room and online is taking home a lot with them, and hopefully we'll take some action as Talia suggested. For those who may not be aware, yesterday our national counterpart Food Banks Canada released their hunger count report, their poverty report card in September. Daily Bread will be releasing Who's Hungry in just a few weeks, and Feed Ontario our hunger report at the end of the month. So there is no shortage of information for you to access to be able to leverage in these circumstances and to speak to your local representatives on how to make change.